Welcome one, welcome all. This is Text of the Matter. I'm Egon.
Hey, I'm Misha.
And this is Hegel.
Yeah.
Hegel. Rhymes with Kegel.
Could you see Hegel doing anti-Kegels?
I could see Kant do it.
Kant do it.
I don't know about Hegel. I think Hegel's too
I need to
freewheeling for
control my urinary pressure.
Do you need to last longer in the bedroom?
Yes.
Have I got a book for you?
Yes.
So, we are here dancing. We are recording our second episode on Hegel's Phenomenology of the Spirit for the second time.
Second, fourth, however you want to put it. But we are here directly confronting Hegel's Phenomenology of the Spirit.
Bum, 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 bum.
Oh, I thought you were about to do the Price is Right song. Bum, bum.
Hegel, come on down. You're the next contestant on Text of the Matter.
Yeah. So, hello, Hegel. What are we getting into
Misha.
today?
So, yeah, we are... we're digging deep into the actual book of Phenomenology of Spirit by Hegel. Last episode, we brought you the preface, which is kind of the most famous part of the book, I think, because most people don't want to actually read the book. And the preface happens to be first. But all the important stuff is actually in the book. So we're going to start talking about that, and namely focus on a section of the book known by many names. Lord and Bondsman is what he uses in this copy of the book. That I think a lot of people hear about, but without context, and so, have a really mutated understanding of what he's actually trying to talk about. And what he's actually trying to talk about is consciousness.
Yes, he's trying to talk about consciousness, self-consciousness. How do we become conscious of ourselves and become a person, right? How do we become something that is unique and self-motivated?
Right. And so in this way, he's very much picking up the baton that was passed to him by Immanuel Kant. But focusing on the things that Kant really was almost embarrassed to even acknowledge. And so...
Yes, what he would call problematic. And, and that's the way he used the dialectic, as problematic things that the understanding could not resolve and had to be resolved by other means, either aesthetics or by morality, etc. And here, Hegel is saying that, no, it's all one thing.
Right, yeah. And so he's taking these contradictions and, really totally changing the perspective and looking at them as necessary poles and in doing so, really changing and really confronting how it is that we create a self, that we create an identity, and then how those selves and identities then interact with one another in the world.
Absolutely.
He starts out very similarly to Kant. He wants to lay out, how it is that, we are able to do all this, how it is that we function in the world. And so this kind of section starts with this idea of sense certainty and perception, which is the two sort of halves that are going to for Hegel build consciousness.
Yes, absolutely. So sense certainty is similar to Kant and it's different to Kant from Kant. So for Kant, we have the phenomenal, right? The way that things appear to us in space and time. For Hegel, this is more of a process, right? That is part of the dialectic, that it is processual. And sense certainty appears to us as a block, as like the whole of that which is external to us. It is the first thing that confronts us, right?
Right.
But as
he says, it's immediate.
It's immediate. It is the immediacy of the world.
Yeah.
And as we confront that, the here, the now, the there, etc., right? And we start to distinguish these elements of what is apparent for us, we start to differentiate it, or it differentiates itself. And that is what he calls the second step, which is perception, right? So where we're getting to, which is self-consciousness, is after these two major moments of the immediacy of sense perception, the process by which we immediately differentiate objects through our perception. And then now we are coming to it at the beginning of what he would call the I, right? Yes. Our self-recognition as being subjects. But we're not fully there, right?
Right.
Like, that's an important part of this whole discourse that he's engaging with. So, with sense certainty and perception, we come from ourselves as an I and start to relate to this whole that is changing, that is multiple, that is complex, that is that diffuses and has parts disappear from it, some that continue and endure, and this he calls life, right?
Yeah.
Life he calls a flux. He calls it enduring existence. This is a totality, which is also what he calls negative or an abstraction. So everything that is external or perceived as external to the subject becomes this abstract unity, this negative universal, this whole that apparently determines us, right? Through experience, through our empirical experience. But at the same time, he sees there as being, with this negativity, the creation of this sort of empty, formal I that comes to see that it is opposed to this negativity of life. It is both part of life and it is taking life as its object, right?
Right. And so in this idea of sense certainty, the first kind of thing that happens for Hegel is what he calls pure being at once splits up into two thises, okay? And so the first this is this as I. And that's our immediate sense certainty perception. But what happens with the creation of this I is there is a second this, which is this as object. And so this is our first mediation in the process of consciousness, where we start to see ourselves as separate from this flux, as apart from it. So, as you go through the world in your consciousness, you're very aware of this distinction between these two thises, that there is an I and that there is an object, whether that's a friend, whether that's a microphone, whatever that is, but that there is a division between what is internalized and what is outside. And this is the first mediation that he kind of develops with this. And so what happens is, in this process of sense certainty, is sort of, again with Kant, is this development of many heres and many nows, what he calls a plurality of heres or a plurality of nows. And what's important about that is that in our experience, we are creating these statements where, here is a microphone. But what Hegel is recognizing is these statements are they don't say what they mean to say. When I say that here is a microphone, I'm trying to say that here, this is a microphone. But what he's identifying is that the content of that statement is actually the now or the here are these universals. And so when I say here is a microphone, I'm actually saying something that's untrue. Because in many moments from now, here will not be a microphone. Here will be a bus when I'm outside. Or, here will be, in his example in the book, he's talking about a tree in front of you. But if you turn around, well, here is not a tree, here is a house.
Yes.
And so he's identifying that the way that we're actually producing our consciousness is through these heres and nows, like space and time for Kant, right?
Absolutely. And so he has this great moment within this section on self-consciousness where he talks about life, this whole, this externality, and its infinite qualities, that it has this infinite axial movement, right? That it's a constant cycle, and that time is composed of these moments as they supersede each other, and that space is composed out of the movement of all of this, right? So you get to see this idea of like the whole of everything as this constant moving, transforming
flux.
Yeah, flux, continuity.
Yeah.
Surface, this whole, right? But at the same time, as we are experiencing this thing, it is this confused continuity of different images and different times and different spaces, etc. We're also abstracting it, right, into these universal concepts. And those universal concepts become more and more complex and more differentiated, and that's really what's of essence in this negative notion of life.
Yeah, I was going to say, that, you would call this like the negative impulse, right?
Yes. There is this flow of differentiating forces. So even though I am just barely an I, right, just barely recognizing consciousness, I am identifying in these objects changes, right? Like, for instance, you have a puppy, right? And you say, okay, this is a dog, right? But as that dog ages, you see it go through different phases and transformations, right? And in our empirical consciousness, there's these inessential elements that the dog is this size or that size, that it has this much hair on its coat or that much hair on its coat.
Right. Smells good or smells bad.
Yeah. These are inessential and fade away. And then what we grasp from it is this kernel of identity that reflects both into us and into itself. It is in itself the I complicating and recognizing its difference from the objects that are outside of it, but at the same time, those objects are reflecting into themselves as concrete concepts, right? That are graspable and communicable and have more meaning, right? And so that's kind of like the first major step of self-consciousness, right?
Yeah, as Hegel would describe it, he calls them alsos, capital A, also, to use these chairs as another example in similarity to the dog, right? I don't know how much the camera can see, but we're sitting in chairs. I'm sitting in a wooden chair. You're sitting in this like plush embroidered chair. But neither of us are confused that both of these are chairs, right? Yeah. And so things can have different properties where one can be wood, one can be soft, one can be hard. But the abstract concept still remains for us. And there's that same kind of unchanging as we see with the dog. Like for me, as well as for the dog, no one is unsure, that like my puppy, when it was a puppy and now it's older, I know it's still the same dog. I know it's my dog Pluto. And Pluto, self-same, it doesn't question that it is Pluto no matter how small or old it gets. And so this is, kind of the base level of consciousness. That there is this creation of self, this I. But this I is troubled.
Yes. And this question of it being for itself or being for another becomes central. Yeah. Because this is where the distinction of what consciousness is arises. As you said, Pluto has some continuity of self, right? And has this recognition. And we could say it might have self-consciousness at this level, right? At the basic level above perception, and probably more. We can speculate on that as we go on. Nonetheless, for Hegel, he's identifying something that's specifically human in our identification of differences and in recognizing that our subjective I is also something that is going on out there in life and is part of the differentiation. So how he describes these differentiations and the way we identify them specifically is as genus, right? Mm-hmm. So he means this in the same way that Aristotle does conventionally. Like, genus leads to us having the span of species in an evolutionary tree, right? But at the same time, there is a different type of genus that Hegel's talking about, which is the process of differentiating objects over time, over like a long historical time, and over a life, right?
And over your lived experience,
yes,
right?
And how that complicates and how we elaborate definitions, ideas, concepts of things, and take that into ourselves, right? But as you said before, this is split, right? It is split between this flux of empirical consciousness and then this reflected aspect that is behind it, but that is unchanging, that is the I, right? That is that we are a subject, that I am. In a Cartesian sense to a degree, but for Hegel, it can't simply be posited.
Right.
It is a process that is produced. The I is produced out of life, out of the negativity and the abstraction of life, and only through that can it become a fully like self-conscious being.
Yeah, and what he's seizing on in this moment is, he's obviously taking for granted this idea that we are, the way in which we experience the world is kind of its own form of creation. But in this internal sense, when we recognize the self, when we recognize the I, that is I, we are not, by acknowledging it, we are also splitting it in two. That by recognizing it in ourselves, we are also creating self, the I, into an object. Because the only way you can acknowledge something, the only way you can look at something is as a spectator. And so by identifying the self within ourself, we've actually created two selves. There is the self and then this object self that we can point to, that we can say, that is me. And for Hegel, this is the problem of the I, is that it is not necessarily a unified self. And so in that process, it is constantly mediating between the I, the capital I, and this object I.
Yes.
This something that is outside of you, despite the fact that it is you.
Yes. And so you got to one of these two important terms in talking about mediation, right? So through mediation and negativity, these are the driving forces, the mechanisms by which this process happens. So as we said, life is this negativity. So negativity is this conceptual abstraction by which we are able to oppose the thing to its own concept, right? Rather than comparing our thoughts to things as if we're relating to something that is external to us. What must be emphasized in Hegel is that there is always a continuity. Even in its differentiation from the subject, there is a way in which it returns to the subject in identity. And so he has three definitions or three aspects of negation that he describes. So this process that we go through in identifying objects leads us to the point at which we recognize this object as an externality, but also as something that is for us, right? And in this, it creates what he calls desire, right? Yeah. And I think you have a really good description of what desire is.
Right. So, like I said, we did this episode once before. I lost all our recordings, so that was cool. But in this moment we're talking about desire, because this is one of these words that's really important for Hegel, capital D, desire, and particularly coming at it from where we are in, being in 2022, desire is wrapped up in ideas of sensuousness, of sexuality, and while that is a part of the definition that Hegel would give desire, really what Hegel is getting at is desire is this movement towards acquiring the object. Desire, without an object, you cannot have desire, right? You could not desire. You have to desire something outside yourself.
Yes.
And so for Hegel, when he says desire, what he's talking about is this urge that we have of acquiring the object, of taking the object and unifying it with the I. Because in many ways, in Hegel's world, the I is everything. In this sort of new agey way, it's like, I am all, I am we.
Yes.
And so when he's talking about desire, he's talking about the attempt at this process, at taking the object and integrating it into the self. And that, for him, is truly what desire is. It is the desire for us to be whole with the world. By taking these objects and making them us. It's our attempt at being whole again.
Yeah. And it's a confused process, right?
Oh, yeah.
And he's explicit about this. And it comes with a satisfaction of realizing that something is external to you, but then coming to understand it and take it into yourself in a new way. So you can see how it relates to the ways that it was interpreted, how desire becomes a meaningful object of psychoanalysis and other forms that make it a drive of sexual desire, of libido, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in this regard, it means, in almost a Spinozan sense, I'm sure there's a Spinozan influence here, that that we are all part of this whole, and that in its differentiation from us, there is also a synthesis, right? There's also a taking back in and a growth of the subject in its powers, right? So that's the first negation vis-a-vis desire through another. The second is determination that is opposed to an indifferent form. So when we view an external object that we do not control, like when we're talking about the dog and the dog's transformation through age, and we realize that this thing is not happening because we think it, but it's happening because of this process of life that we can determine and identify in a specific way, right? That idea that we see this determination that's external to us, but that is also taken back into our knowledge, is another way in which negation relates to the I. And then in the third, most general sense, it's as universal life, as we said, as a flux, as the total negation in our abstracting the whole of the world that we experience as a thing, right? As something that is not I. But then simultaneously is the mechanism through which we can reflect and take in objects and compose the I in an empirical sense. So this is this double consciousness that he's talking about, and which you might hear in Dubois, right? Who talks about the double consciousness of the black man in Cesaire when he talks about negritude, or as we talked about in one of our earlier sessions at Franz Fanon, right? This is a lineage of theorists who are talking about race, but they're all deriving it from this dialectical concept of the double consciousness and the way in which two consciousness could be held. One that is I as a black man, and another that is I as the object that is determined by the white consciousness. Right?
Exactly.
Or, as you described Fanon, I mean, I as a Frenchman versus I as a person who comes from another country and has a different origin and a colonial past.
So Fanon, of course, writes about this. He's moves to France, comes from one of the colonies in, I can't remember which country he comes from, but one of the islands in the Bahamas or in the Gulf area. And he considers himself a French subject. He considers himself French. And then, of course, moves to France, where French people do not see him and his dark skin as being French. And then really has to sever his identity in two, to keep his consciousness going, right? Because on one hand, the identity he's created for himself is a Frenchman, but is now being told that he is not a Frenchman. And so, and that's part of the dialectical process. How do you unify those two things?
Yes. is there a reconciliation? And how would that be possible? Is it possible through the mind? And that is really the question that Hegel raises, And so he, in the final part of this section, he lists 3 moments of self-consciousness, right? Facing the immediacy of an object through a moment or movement of life, right? So here we see the time and the space being composed out of this empirical externality, right? And then being taken back in, mediated through the eye, right? The second is literally mediation, the supersession of the object by self-conscious desire, which produces genus. So when he says desire, it's like the mind of the scientist to try to understand the object, or let's say the mind of the person who's to become a scientist, observing in an object some strange phenomenon and seeing it transform and do something different. They haven't quite yet turned that into knowledge, but there is this observation of its difference, and that is a desire for the object in the Hegelian sense.
Right.
And that process is how we determine its identity, its genus, and place it within a network, a elaborating, let's say, tree of differentiations that go from the greatest universals to the most specific differences, right?
And as, of course, we've learned from Kant, the only way to do that is to internalize it. And so that is this desire of the object is, and the only way to understand something that is object to you is to internalize it, which is to take it in some ways. And, you could perhaps critique that and extend that to the sort of appropriative nature of our society today, and this desire, this taking urge. But I think at this breath, and regarding Hegel, what we're really talking about is this internalization of what is outside of us in an attempt to reconcile ourselves with the universe.
Absolutely. And his third is the reflection of the object into itself and into another, right? And is for itself a genus. So in this regard, once we have that recognition of the object, we've turned it into something that is knowledge, that is understanding. It reflects into itself into our I. So that's a sense in which she means the in itself, right? Being in itself, right? The I in itself comes to know the thing, and that thing, the concept of it, becomes part of the subject. And then at the same time, the object itself gains a life of its own as concept, as this mediated new object with its full conceptualization. And so at the end of it, he brings up this idea of the spirit, right? And that's when he says, an I that is we, and a we that is an I, right? That we are recognizing in another that there is a consciousness for itself, but that is also for us, right? That also becomes part of us and forms this whole of consciousness, this whole of the I, that is all of human consciousness, which is a very major and powerful concept. But where he brings this to is his section on Lordship and Bondage, or what is often called the slave master dialectic. And he takes it in a very different way, in a almost parable or allegory on the process by which a person gains consciousness in a specific context.
Yeah, for a guy who doesn't get metaphorical, he gets very metaphorical with this, like parable almost of the Lord and the Bondsman. And so in this development of self-consciousness, kind of what we've been talking about, and self-consciousness, let's think about that word, consciousness of self. And so in this consciousness of self, we are splitting ourself, because there is the I and then the self we recognize in the I. And so you have Hegel creating this duality of identity, okay? That the in itself is mediated by the duality of self. That, there is this I that's seemingly in charge that can also recognize in itself a self that is doing the things that it wants to do. And so he's trying to talk about this through the concept of recognizing and being recognized.
Yeah, so there's a double movement that I think you're trying to identify very clearly, which is there is both this conflict within ourselves and there is this conflict between people. And so here he describes it as between people, but it equally has meaning as an internal struggle.
Right. And this is kind of the first part where understanding what he's trying to accomplish here can get skewed because, obviously Marx would tease out these ideas of alienation and labor. As we'll see, Hegel's really talking about an internal struggle, and that inside of us there is a Lord that enjoys, that consumes. But this enjoyment vanishes because the Lord is dependent upon his bondsman, his subject, his servant, to produce these pleasures. And so basically the two sides of yourself are alienated from one another.
Yes. But also, in a historical context, Hegel is looking at the Haitian Revolution, and he is seeing a group of enslaved people rise up against their masters. And so he also sees that there is this strange process of recognition between subjects that is also complex. So with the Lord, as Egon said, the slave is doing everything for them. They eat food produced by their slaves or their serfs, if we want to speak in the European context. They are they move or they have work done for them by these people. The slave or the serf or the bondsman, they have no consciousness of their own. They live only through the master, right? Their consciousness is entirely determined by the master and the master's will. And so the master cannot recognize the slave at all because the slave isn't even human, isn't even a conscious subject for him. But the slave does have a possibility of coming to a recognition of consciousness through a process. The process begins with fear.
Yes.
Right? The fear of death. The possibility that the master can end life at any time, right? This terror at the possibility of repercussion. And so recognizing this terror allows the bondsman for the first time to see that they themselves have this life that can go away, right?
That is the source of their fear, right? This fear comes from the end of their self, which means they have to acknowledge the self that they have. Whereas before, that wasn't acknowledged because the master is dictating everything. And absolutely. So they are living not for self, but for another.
Absolutely.
And in this fear, a self is born.
Yes. But it isn't fully worked through. And I use worked in a very specific sense because for Hegel, it is through the process of working and creating and externalizing this newly found self, work for the master, that the bondsman comes to realize that there is some power that it has outside of itself and where it can fully realize this process of negation and abstraction in the object that is outside of it, in that sense that was once the master or the Lord in full.
Right.
And so the way that he resolves this is through what he calls a death struggle. And so we can think of this in the figurative sense that Egon's teasing out, and we can also think of this in the literal sense that the Lord cannot recognize the slave. So the slave must fight to the death to gain their recognition, that the bondsman must fight to the death to gain their recognition. And this is what played out in historical reality for Hegel, and Hegel was trying to capture that. But just the same as Egon was describing, there is a struggle internally to overcome this idea that we are absolutely determined by the external and that we have a power over ourselves, a freedom, right? And this is where Hegel is working to. What is freedom? How do we become free and have control over our lives through self-consciousness?
Right. Yeah, and I think part of this Lord and Bondsman section gets talked about a lot too, because at the end of it, there is this veiled Christian idea that, he's sort of elevating the bondsman in that only through staking your life, risking everything, through discipline and service and work, can you actually develop a self. And this on its own, though, creates its own set of problems.
Yes, certainly.
And, while it's sort of an important touchstone of this book, it's really the middle point in this development of consciousness for Hegel. For Hegel, this, taking this obvious power dynamic, right? When I say master-slave, when I say lord and bondsman, you understand the power dynamic. And he's trying to subvert it. He's trying to subvert it by recognizing that it is actually the master who is dependent on the slave. That even though the relationship is built one way, it's actually expressing its opposite. And that the slave isn't dependent on the master. In some ways, yes, but the bondsman is the one that's actually creating. And through this creation, through this risking of self, a self is actually formed.
Yes, and one can question: is anyone really being recognized here? In some ways, yes, but in some ways, no. It's really the recognition of the self, self-reflection on the I, right? And in that is the core of what Hegel's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
How we turn this externality into something that is usable as a human being. But that connects us to other human beings insofar as that we then desire, that we then engage with objects, in the production of objects, in the identification and understanding of objects, and in doing so transform the world and transform life. Right? So when he leaves this dialectic between the Lord and the Bondsman, he comes to this question of concepts of freedom, right? And he begins with what you would call the Stoic idea of freedom, right? And he says that this is an idea of freedom that can only come from a world of bondage.
Yes, of terror and bondage.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the Stoic is someone who recognizes that there is an illusory character to life, but in recognizing this, denies it. So in a sense, denies half of themselves. Right.
And so I just want to add, right? So in the sort of Lord and the Bondsman parable, you have a bifurcated self. It's a self that is two parts in struggle with one another. And in the next section, freedom of self-consciousness, he starts talking about what Miller, the translator of this in his analysis, calls exemplary consciousness. And so for his first example, he used Stoicism, as you're describing, where it is a thinking mind. But because it is only concerned with thought, we are leaving the actual empirical world behind us. And so even though it's a unified consciousness, it is a unified consciousness that is half dormant.
Yes, that is denying half of itself, the empirical self, the self that's engaging with the world. So there is this duality that freedom is, on the one hand, the recognition of pure thought, but that it never becomes truly free until you recognize how that pure thought relates to what it is not. Right? And that is the problem of Stoicism. Right? So then he brings up this second aspect, which is something that's more contemporary to him, which is skepticism, right? So in his description, skepticism is a very complex form of thought insofar as it recognizes what the Stoics recognized, but that it begins to engage in with the external world, but it does so only negatively, right? It does so only by undermining the reality of that which is inessential, right? By being skeptical of the truth and the goodness of the world outside of the eye, right? And by having this position, it acknowledges the second half of itself that is in contradiction, right? But it remains sustained and unchanged, right? It attaches itself to the unchangeable form of thinking, and it constantly is almost in a critical mode against the unnecessary, negative, universal side of life.
Right. And so he like really famously talks about it as a child. So, in bringing up his dialectics, he always talks about, the kind of closer you get to truth, the more it solicits its antithesis, and vice versa. So the more you come to pure certainty over that antithesis, the more it solicits that original truth. And he expresses this through the idea of a skeptic as a small child who will argue A until you argue A, and then in which they will immediately switch to arguing for B. And this is that negative, totally negative aspect you bring about, that the skeptic can see the illusion of, say, empiricism, but can also see the illusion or the failing of not believing, as the Stoics do in the real world at all. That they are very much rooted in a kind of logic, but understand that they still must live in the real world and must deal with normal things. And so there's this constant reversal that is the dance the skeptic plays.
Yeah, and it's difficult, and it is also constantly abstract, because even as they deal with the world, they're abstracting the world.
Right.
It's sustained negativity, right? And then there is this kind of third phase, which takes a little bit more in, which is what he calls the unhappy consciousness.
The unhappy that's the highest one that he gives us, is the unhappy consciousness. So
I'll
tell you a lot about Hegel.
Yes. So what makes the unhappy consciousness unhappy? It's that it is searching for what is true and what is good in thinking, in doing, in living in the world, but it cannot quite grasp it, because to do so requires a going beyond the simple I, going beyond simple consciousness to realize it. And so Hegel recognizes that there is a problem in trying to find immediately the good or the true, to find these things that bring pleasure without going through their opposite, right? Mm-hmm. That it requires to get to a point of satisfaction where you truly understand the non-necessity of these things. To find their necessity is to get rid of one's property and one's control over the self, to get rid of one's ability to choose, right? And to make sacrifice, right? So the unhappy consciousness is what is before a person is able to make these actual real changes that allow them to then get close to this beyond or reason about the world that remains unfixed and hazy.
Yeah, and to add on to the why is this consciousness unhappy, is that it does recognize this need for sacrifice, but instead of ascribing the benefit that comes from the sacrifice to itself, it rather cedes that guilt, if I shall use a funny word, and lays it at the feet of the beyond.
Yes.
And so the way that Hegel kind of describes this is the unhappy consciousness is actually a unified consciousness. The for itself and the for another are unified by the bridge of the unhappy consciousness. But the unhappy consciousness isn't aware that it is that bridge.
Yes.
That allows the self to go from the seen to the seer and back again.
And in this regard, this is a way in which, unlike Kant, Hegel is willing to question the religious power in which people, what Kant called summum bonum, which we talked about in our Kant and Deleuze and Adorno episode, whereas the good is determined by the kingdom of God, by aspiring towards the kingdom of God, whereas Hegel sees this beyond as actually being within the subject, right? What is beyond is actually already there to be realized, and this is one of the major differences between Kant and Hegel.
Right, yeah, certainly. And it's an important distinction to make because it is, what sets in motion the change of the next several hundred years, where it is, a kind of valuing of human selfhood, of the human condition, and of course for Hegel, though, it sort of the direction it goes is never realized for Hegel, because for Hegel, he does see the I as the we, that the self is the all. And so, of course, you must look in the self for benediction. You must look in the self for that unification, because the self contains all.
Yes.
And pointing away from the sort of religious authority, the religious doctrine as orthodoxy, right, that sort of is plaguing his time, and this is very important. And I think that it's important too because this is one of the ways in which philosophy subtly undermines the status quo and changes things sometimes without explicitly saying that that's what it's doing.
Yeah.
Because it's creating a new self. It's creating a new object for us to internalize.
Yeah, well, he has an interesting conflict at the end of this section, which is, in one way, he is rejecting this doxa of the Christian order of God as determining what is the good and the true. But at the same time, what are the mechanisms to get to internalizing a full self-consciousness so that you can go beyond it are these very Jesus-like qualities, this surrendering of the will, this foregoing property and enjoyment, sacrificing the right to decide, doing what one does not understand, which is actually what I think is one of the most wonderful parts of this, because that is kind of like the last step for this process of the unhappy consciousness. It is in challenging oneself to think what cannot be thought, to do what is unexpected or what cannot be done, is what allows us to then realize that it was already always there, contained within us, to challenge the norms and tendencies of the present, right? And we'll get into this when in a later episode when we talk about some writers on Hegel. But this is one of the ways in which Hegel complicates the process in which norms are determined in our society, that we always must be challenging those norms through a active engagement with the abstraction of the world and the difficulty and differentiation of the world.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's why the parable of the master-slave dynamic, I think, is taught so often in schools, because, like, you know, to achieve this transcendence of societal norms, of you know, going beyond sort of the culture that maybe keeps us in these holding patterns, right? I mean, you know, the Lord and Bondsman dynamic still resonates with us today, as far as like the social dynamic that we live with. And what Hegel's really trying to do is he's trying to unify those forces. He's trying to say that pleasure and work have to be unified, that they're not separate poles, you know, or to put it in a more abstract way, desire and sacrifice have to be unified.
Yes.
And only through that unification can we actually actualize this thing we call the self.
Yes. We cannot end at the simple satisfaction of realizing something's externality to us and its complexity, but that we have to work for it, that we have to work through it, that we have to complicate our understanding of the whole as a people, right? And, you know, much of this is lost in the kind of like understanding of Hegel and in our contemporary understanding, like that we are still arguing these like very ancient ideas that go well before Christian thought, that the sacrifice of the self can lead to greater being, that the that doing what is unexpected or what seems impossible, right, will teach us what truly is possible and will change the way that we relate to the world, is a good thing or is a powerful thing or is a way to the true. You know, it's still something that's fought over against tradition, against the being steadfast in holding that life as it is the only way, right? And I would say if Hegel were to see the kind of way that the world is talked about, he would be shocked by its kind of stultifying naturalism.
Yeah. And you know, I mean, of course, because you might be sitting out there and being like, well, okay, guys, like, how does Hegel think we can do this crazy, you know, unification game? And in a very Enlightenment fashion, for Hegel, that tool is reason. And so, you know, the fact that our political discourse can be so unreasoned or based so much on you know, identity and narrative and emotion, I think would shock him.
Yeah,
to some extent. So,
and just one last point, that clearly for Hegel, all of that is included in the process to reason, right?
Yeah.
That we must go through these things, but at the end, right, once we have gone through that process, there should be a change. If there is not a change, then you have not reached reason, right? And this isn't to say that just changing your ideas is naturally reasonable. He's outlining a very like strict process by which you apprehend objects and truly analyze them and take them into yourselves and take things that are other than yourselves and make yourself that thing, right? Make the for you, the in itself, right? Yeah,
he's not talking about a change of ideas. He's talking about the change of the structure of acquiring ideas.
Yes.
You know, it's and for him in this dialectical movement, that's the force he's referring to is you know, the dialectical change of the structure of consciousness. Truly.
Absolutely. So I think that pretty much covers this episode.
Yeah, I would say so.
We're really excited to be talking about Hegel. We're probably going to do one more episode on Hegel. And we thank you all for joining us on this journey. We got more to come.
Hell yeah. Smash that like button. We got a Patreon if you want to, you know, help us out and contribute to the crazy work we do. And yeah, follow us on YouTube. We've got follow us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and till next time.
Text of the matter out.